Good morning. I was asked to talk about this from the perspective of having been involved in the group that eliminated it as a term. Back in 2008, we reviewed the federal wildland fire policy and made changes that resulted in the 2009 update. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit as I go through this presentation. Again, I like these word clouds, but for this particular topic, it's a very appropriate one. It shows many of the different things we have called what used to be known as prescribed natural fire, wildland fire use, and now there's a plethora of terms that many of them are somewhat misguided. I think I heard managed fires. Well, all of our fires are supposed to be managed. I heard multiple objectives fires. Every fire has multiple objectives, regardless of whether you're suppressing it or trying to achieve some benefit from it. Now, there's multiple strategies that might be more appropriate to be talking about some of those fires. But that's just a little bit of my perspective there. Background. Reviews indicated in 2008, or leading to 2008, when we revised the implementation guide, that wildland fire use, the term we use to call fires that we manage for resource benefits during about a 20-year period there, was limited due to the inability to change objectives and strategies during the course of a fire. It was limited because we were unable to adjust a maximum manageable area once we set that. And then the WFU process, the Wildland Fire Implementation Plan process, was viewed as cumbersome with time frames for completion that were hard for some units to meet on some fires. And often folks would be working on a WFU for a week before it was completed. And during that time, the fire could do a lot of things that perhaps might not have been expected or wanted. The Warm Fire comes to mind on the Kaibab National Forest in mid-2000s that burned 60,000 acres prior to them completing the Wildland Fire Implementation Plan. They also indicated that the FUMA position, the Fire Use Management position, was viewed as an incident commander having collateral duties. And the Kramer fire that occurred in the early 2000s on the Salmon Chalice National Forest caused a review of collateral duty ICs, which resulted in us, the Forest Service, prohibiting that for any of our incident commanders, which included FUMAs. And so there was a need to adjust that skill position, at least for the Forest Service, as part of this review. It was also viewed as lack of support by public cooperators and internal staff due to continued misunderstanding of what we were doing on any specific fire. So we would label the fire as a wildland fire use fire. Members of the public thought, no, well, there's a fire up there on the hill and they're just ignoring it. Some of our internal folks, whether it was a wildlife biologist, a timber person, or you name it, didn't understand that there was actually a lot of planning and consideration given to that fire to try to achieve benefits and to try to limit undesired outcomes. So simply labeling it didn't convey the full information about what it was that we're actually doing with any specific fire. Well, the group of federal and non-federal folks convened in Denver in the summer of 2008 to review and potentially revise the guidance for implementation of the federal wildland fire policy. We were tasked to assess the three fire concept. At that time, there was wildfire, prescribed fire, and wildland fire use, all of them under the title of wildland fire. We were to evaluate and recommend any changes to terminology, and the group included Forest Service, Park Service, BIA, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service. There were state reps there, NGOs such as Wilderness Society and TNC. So it was not just the feds or just the Forest Service reviewing this. Several terms were being used instead of wildland fire use even then. In 2008, I continued to hear folks talking about the let burn policy. You still hear it today. Or prescribed natural fire, or PNF. Appropriate management response was another term that came into vogue during the 2000s that was used interchangeably with wildland fire use. And I heard a lot of folks talk about, we're going to AMR this fire. Well, The appropriate management response was intended to address all fire and all responses. That we would take an appropriate response, and that response might be full perimeter containment of a fire, suppression, or it might be not taking any action on the fire, just monitoring. But the appropriate management response was supposed to convey the idea of that full spectrum of responses that one might take to an unplanned ignition. However, it came to be used mostly for those fires that were labeled as wildland fire use fires at that time. So there was a lot of misunderstanding of terminology that was going on at the time, and we wanted to clean it up. I don't think we did a very good job, but natural fire was another term that was used. Again, many members of the public assumed that any fire that was not immediately extinguished was being allowed to let burn. I addressed a public meeting following the 2008 fires in Northern California, and all of the fires on the Shasta Trinity National Forest had suppression strategies. None of them were being managed for resource benefit or wildland fire use fires. Yet the public assumed that because we didn't have folks on a fire, we were just allowing it to burn, just letting it burn. At that time, I think over a 48-hour period, we had over 2,000 starts in Northern California, and we simply could not get to all the fires soon enough to avoid having many of them get big. So again, a lot of misunderstanding and confusion by public, cooperators, and even internally about what we were doing with fire. Recommendations that were adopted from this group allowed the addition or elimination of objectives after initial and subsequent decisions on a fire. So once you decided that you were going to suppress this fire, as the fire continued on, you could change that decision and decide to manage a portion of it for resource benefit, and go back and forth depending on where the fire went and the conditions the fire was burning under. There's a variety of reasons why one might change. I worked for the Park Service for a number of years, and many parks did not allow wildland fire use until after Labor Day. After Labor Day, the visitor use reduced tremendously, and there were a lot less threats to the public using that particular park. So if a fire started on September 1st, they might have a suppression objective, but then September 4th or 5th, it might be okay to allow it to burn with very little risk to the public. So those kinds of situations came into play, and not just temporally, but spatially. As the fire moved across the landscape, if you couldn't put it out in an area of high values and it got into an area of low values, why would we then want to take a lot of time and effort to put a fire out that is actually doing good just because it started in an area that it wasn't doing good? So that was one of the things we changed in the implementation strategy. We allowed for resource management objectives to be included on wildfires that had very specific protection objectives. So on many fires that had WUI adjacent to the fire, if you had a protection objective established for the fire, you weren't allowed to establish also a resource benefit objective. And that just didn't make sense, where one side of a fire you could aggressively attack, but the other side didn't make sense to do anything to. I managed a fire as an IC in northern Idaho a few years ago that part of it was moving towards Stanley and very expensive communities along Highway 70 corridor, and the other side of the fire, the east side, was running up into the wilderness area that there was no reason to take any suppression action on. At that time, I think it was 2005, we weren't allowed to manage it for resource benefit, but we also weren't compelled to suppress areas that had no value to suppress. Ideally, I could have established resource benefit objectives on that fire, but I wasn't allowed to at the time. One of the key points, it was understood that all wildfires must have protection objectives, while some wildfires may also have resource benefit objectives. And again, that is a key point that exists to this day. Any fire, whether you're managing it for resource benefit, if it's in the middle of the Selway Bitter Wilderness, you need to be thinking about any protection objectives that might come into play at some point before the end of the summer, before it self-extinguishes. Even though it's in the middle, it could get out and damage some value. And so we're trying to instill in folks the idea that yeah, it's okay to manage fires, and we should manage fires for resource benefit, but you always need to be looking out to those areas that the fire may potentially damage or have an undesired outcome in it as the fire season moves on. Another note, and I think I already mentioned it, suppression is not an objective. It's a strategy for achieving a protection objective. And again, trying to just clean up our terminology a little bit. Other changes, temporally dynamic, allowed objectives for an individual wildfire to change over time. Resource benefit objectives could be added after an initial decision or added, removed, and added again as the fire moved across space and into time. Spatially dynamic allowed portions of a fire to have resource benefit objectives and other portions to have protection objectives. No maximum manageable area was required. And the old process with the wildland fire implementation plan, you needed to establish a box that if the fire got out of that, it was converted to a suppression fire. And no longer could you manage it for resource benefit objectives. With the new implementation guide, you don't have to define a box. You can manage it in a much more dynamic fashion and adjust as the weather and season provides opportunities. Again, all of those changes provided a great deal of flexibility, and at the time we naively assumed that that was going to cause a real boon to wildland fire use or managing fires for resource benefit. Unfortunately, it didn't quite play out that way. Without the Wildland Fire Use Program, there was not an organizing entity to champion the use of fire. And at the time, 2008, I was the Fire Use Program Manager for the Forest Service. And that program was eliminated, and it then became more just the prescribed fire manager. The U.S. Forest Service eliminated the Wildland Fire Use Award that was awarded to that person or that local unit that demonstrated the best, most progressive use of fire. There had been regional and national awardees, and that was stopped after that policy change or implementation guide change. Wildland fire use teams were dropped, except for one that still exists, Diane Hutton's team in the Northern Rockies. It was expected that Type 1 and Type 2 teams would be retrofitted to take on management of fire with resource benefit objectives. Few have done this. Those teams need to include strategic operational planners as well as long-term analysts in their core membership, and many teams have not done that. Nor have many of those teams fully embraced the concept of managing fires for resource benefit. For the old wildland fire use management teams, that was their bread and butter, that was their core business. In a series of years after 2009, there were regional and then national suspensions of using wildfires to achieve resource benefit that really put a damper that exists to this day in local units taking this on. After the national suspension in 2012, there was a significant reduction in the use of wildfires for resource benefit. In some cases, even though the intent was for resource benefits, the local unit labeled the action confinement or containment. Subcategories of suppression strategies deemed acceptable by cooperators in the public. So even some folks were continuing to do that a little bit kind of under the cover and using other terminology to describe what they were doing. It was good that they were getting more fire in the landscape, but not helpful for full understanding of what we were doing out there. In my previous position, the Fire Use Program Manager lapsed for a year and was refilled as a National Fuel Specialist. Frankie is in that job, and he's doing good to rekindle that effort from a national perspective. Some of our intent was to instill a much broader use of natural ignitions to play the ecological role they played prior to European invasion. Some people call it settlement, and to take advantage of opportunities to reduce hazards on the landscape. That was our intent when we changed the terminology and some of those requirements that had been in place prior to 2009. Again, there's more flexibility now than there ever has been, but less use than there has been in probably 20 years. Prescribed natural fire, some of the terms we talked about, prescribed natural fire was deemed to have historical baggage, harkening back to the 1988 Yellowstone fires. Wildland fire use was deemed to be too closely associated with prescribed fire. Again, these are some of the discussion points we had as we were talking about terminology. Consensus was reached that instead of labeling fires, we should describe them, and I still feel strongly about that today, that simply labeling a fire doesn't convey to the public or cooperators or internally what it is we're doing out there. Call it wildland fire use, call it fire use, call it prescribed natural fire. What does that mean on the North Fire on the Cibola National Forest? That they managed this year 40,000 acres of good fire use, done at the same time as the, I think the doghead fire, dogleg fire, burning on the north end of the forest that was burning homes down. What they were doing on the North Fire was allowing fire to burn under low intensity to fireproof some of their relic ponderosa pine stands that had been being burned up and destroyed by high intensity fire. They had the opportunities and the condition to get them fireproofed, so to speak, for a period of time by allowing a natural ignition to burn through them back down slopes and remove that understory that would contribute to a stand replacement fire at some point in the future. Telling folks that makes a lot more sense than telling them that we have a wildland fire use fire out there, or we're using fire out there. You got to be specific about what it is you're doing on specific fires. One of the concerns that was expressed during that meeting and then subsequent was the inability to count and report accomplishments of managing fire for resource benefit. And subsequent to 2009, there's been a lot of effort undertaken by a variety of folks within the agencies to continue to label these fires for this purpose, to count the acres. And I think there's other ways of counting those acres that are more meaningful. The monitoring trends and burn severity program is one way of doing that that makes more sense than just labeling a fire that this is a fire use fire, so all those acres are good acres. Again, there was a naive assumption that freeing many of the requirements, the WFUs, the inability to change objectives, would dramatically increase the opportunistic use of wildfires. Does not seem to have played out that way. What we didn't foresee was the dwindling use of fire when a program, the Wildland Fire Use Program, was eliminated or merged with the suppression program. Some of the other alternatives discussed was return to PNF as a label, continue with wildland fire use, but the one that we selected was eliminate the naming distinction between fires with and without resource benefit objectives and encourage managers to describe what they are doing and why they are doing it. For example, partial perimeter containment on the west and north flanks and allowing fire to restore native grasslands on the south and east flanks makes a lot more sense than telling the public this is a fire use fire. They get it, they understand, and they will support it if they get it. There was some discussion about allowing human-caused fires to be managed for resource benefit. The Forest Service opted against that. I think the Park Service has that as an option. I don't know to what extent the Park Service uses that, but for the Forest Service, our Office of General Counsel folks convinced us that we shouldn't go there for a variety of reasons, mostly because we collect a lot of money on trespass fires over the last decade or so, hundreds of millions of dollars. So we are not allowed to use fires for resource benefit that are human caused. Fire use is still an acceptable term to describe what's occurring and can be used internally and in general fashion, but shouldn't be used to label an individual fire. You should follow up with a specific use. Why are you using it? What is it that you're doing? And that concludes my session.
Okay, well, I think, thank you, Jim.